beneath the bleeding sky of the Danube and the ghosted slopes of the Carpathians, two titans waged their reckoning. When Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, turned his gaze northward, he met Stephen the Great of Moldavia, a prince whose faith outweighed his realm's size. Through strategy and sacrifice, Stephen transformed his very land into a weapon against Ottoman might, turning valleys into graves at Vaslui, where fog became ally and mud devoured invaders. Though empires recorded victory and retreat differently, both understood the truth. Sometimes the most enduring conquest is simply to remain unconquered. In this shadow war between patience and pride, survival itself became triumph. Before dawn, the domes of Constantinople gleamed like hammered gold, catching the first light that bled across the Bosporus. The call to prayer rose through the chill air, echoing against marble and sea. From his palace above the water, Mehmed II listened in silence. The sound pleased him. It was the proof that the city, once called Byzantium, had been claimed, mastered, and remade into the beating heart of his dominion. He had been a conqueror since youth, barely 21 when he broke the walls of Constantinople in 1453 AD. Now, 2 decades later, the empire he forged pulsed outward in every direction. West into the Balkans, east into Anatolia, north toward the glittering line of the Danube. Yet triumph carried its own hunger. Power that does not move begins to die, and Mehmed feared stagnation more than defeat. In the council hall of Topkapi, maps were spread like wounds upon the floor. His viziers traced frontiers with sticks of cedar charcoal. Bosnia subdued, Serbia bound in chains, the islands of the Aegean nearly tamed. Only the northern marches still defied his authority, those cold, pine-covered lands beyond the Danube, where Christian princes ruled from wooden fortresses and prayed to the same god in another tongue. Of these, Moldavia troubled him most. To his treasurers, Moldavia was a line of missing numbers. Its ruler, Stephen the Great, had ceased sending the annual 10,000 ducats owed in tribute. To the merchants of Constantinople, Moldavia was a theft, its raids choking the trade that linked the Black Sea port of Kaffa to the markets of Krakow. And to the Sultan himself, it was an insult, a defiance whispered from behind forests and marshes, daring the world's most powerful monarch to cross the river and prove his wrath. Mehmed studied the Danube on the parchment, that long silver artery of Europe. Whoever mastered its crossings, he thought, could hold Christendom by the throat. But a conqueror who turns his gaze north must first silence the hornets guarding the shore. He would do so in time. For now, he watched and measured. The army he commanded was an organism of terrifying efficiency. At its heart marched the Janissaries, the Sultan's children in spirit if not in blood, raised from Christian households, trained in silence, each unit an author, every movement drilled to the rhythm of drum and flute. Around them rode the Sipahi, provincial cavalrymen bound to the Sultan by land grants and pride, their horsetails braided with silk. Ahead swept the Akunchu, raiders and scouts who lived for fire, and behind trudged the Azap footmen, their leather caps white with frost. When this machine moved, the earth itself seemed to tremble. But even machines stumble in mud and snow. Mehmed remembered the winter campaigns of earlier years. Horses dying in their traces, muskets freezing solid, men losing fingers to cold. Moldavia's forests would test even the most disciplined ranks. He would send another first. Let one of his lieutenants bleed the path clear. When spring came, he would ride north himself to finish the work. In the marble corridors outside the council hall, the empire's bureaucracy hummed like an unending prayer. Scribes inked decrees for new taxes, coin masters weighed tribute from Bosnia and Albania, and couriers departed hourly, bearing orders sealed in vermilion wax. Somewhere in the noise, Mehmed heard the empire's heartbeat, steady, relentless, but not yet satisfied. South of the Carpathians, the frontier smoldered. Wallachia, Moldavia's neighbor, had changed allegiance so often that even its chroniclers despaired of keeping count. Its current ruler, Basarab Lyota, bent his knee to the strongest wind of the moment. When Ottoman emissaries rode through his towns, they found the Crescent raised on the gates. When Hungarian envoys followed, the flags changed again by morning. Mehmed despised such flexibility. It was weakness masquerading as cunning. Still, he understood its uses. Through Wallachia, his armies would march, and the prince who betrayed everyone might yet serve him best. In December 1473 AD, news came that Stephen of Moldavia had once again raided Ottoman lands and harbored Wallachian exiles. The treasury losses mounted, and the Sultan's patience thinned to wire. At the midwinter council, he stood before his generals, the lamplight flashing on his armor, and spoke only one sentence: "Let Rumelia assemble her host. The Crescent will rise beyond the Danube." Thus began the summons to war. Hadam Suleiman Pasha, governor of Rumelia and veteran of countless sieges, was commanded to abandon his campaign in Albania and march north. Messengers rode to every province, to Bosnia for horsemen, to Vidin for engineers, to Bulgaria for woodcutters and bridge builders. The imperial scribes recorded the decree under the tokra of the Sultan, and within weeks the rumble of mustering echoed across the Balkans. By early autumn 1474, Suleiman's camps ringed the city of Sofia, like iron seeds sown on frost. Janissary orthas drilled with matchlocks. The Sipahi exercised their mounts on frozen fields. Oxen dragged cannon cast in Edirne for the new campaign. Every sunrise, drums beat through the mist, a heartbeat of empire. Far to the north, in the monasteries of Suceava and Niemts, Moldavian priests lit candles before icons blackened by years of smoke. They prayed not for victory, but for endurance. Stephen, their prince, walked among his fortresses, inspecting walls, counting barrels of powder, speaking quietly with the captains who would soon hold their ground against impossible numbers. The men he led called him Voyevodul Shel Mare, the great commander. To the peasants who tilled the frozen earth, he was something nearer to sacred, a warrior of God defending the last gate of Christendom. The two worlds did not yet touch, but both felt the pull of collision. From Constantinople to Krakow, merchants whispered that the Sultan would strike in the next season. Venetian reports reached Rome describing a fleet of supply barges built on the lower Danube, enough to feed an army for a year. And still, Stephen did not yield. The tribute remained unpaid. The border remained aflame. In Constantinople, the Sultan's astrologers charted favorable omens. A new crescent moon would rise over the northern horizon in early January 1475 AD, a sign, they claimed, that victory awaited. Mehmed smiled at their certainty, but trusted numbers more than stars. He read reports of Moldavian villages, their garrisons few, their supplies poor, their roads narrow. Let the fog be theirs, he said, and the road ours. Night after night, he walked the terraces of Topkapi, watching the lanterns of ships drift along the strait like sparks on black water. Somewhere beyond that darkness lay a land of forests, frozen rivers, and a prince who thought himself chosen by heaven. Mehmed wondered what such faith felt like. His own was made of calculation, sharper, colder, more enduring. As winter settled across the empire, Suleiman Pasha began the long march from Sofia toward the Danube. Columns of troops stretched for miles, their breath steaming in the air, the ground trembling under hooves and wheels. The river ahead was locked in ice, the sky a vault of pewter. When the first ranks stepped onto the frozen crossing, the sound of cracking echoed like distant gunfire. On the far bank, the banners of Wallachia waited, Basarab Laiota kneeling in the snow before the Ottoman envoy. Behind them, the horizon glowed faintly, the reflection of campfires spreading eastward toward Moldavia. The campaign had begun. In Constantinople, the sea winds turned colder. Mehmed stood again at his window, looking north. Somewhere in that darkness, his empire was moving. Tens of thousands of men advancing beneath the same moon that hung above his city. He felt the old thrill return, the one that had filled him on the morning he breached the walls of Constantinople, the moment before history changes shape. The city slept below him, unaware that its emperor had already set his gaze upon a new horizon. Soon the rivers of the north would freeze solid, the valleys would fill with fog, and the empire's banners would cross into a land no map could fully name. The Crescent was rising once more, pale and cold against the stars. Its light did not warm, but it reached everywhere. Between the forests and the sea stretched a principality too small to matter on any map, and yet large enough to disturb an empire. Moldavia was a country of rivers and watchtowers, monasteries walled like castles, and hills that guarded their secrets under mist. To the north rose the Carpathians, steep and patient. To the south, the Danube curled like a living border, swollen with thaw. In that narrow corridor between mountain and empire, history found its last line of resistance. At the center of it stood Stephen, Prince of Moldavia, the man his people called Cel Mare, the Great. He had been born amid turbulence and baptized in treachery. His father, Bogdan II, was murdered by his own brother, and Stephen spent his youth in exile, a guest of foreign courts and soldiers. When he returned in 1457 AD, it was not with parchment or pleas, but with 6,000 horsemen lent by his ally in Wallachia, Vlad the Impaler. They crossed the Siret River under storm clouds and struck the usurper at Orbic. By dusk, Stephen had reclaimed his father's seat. The throne he inherited was made of wood and peril. Moldavia's neighbors, Poland, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, loomed like wolves around a wounded deer. Tribute flowed north, south, and west in uneven measure, a diplomacy of coin and conscience. Yet Stephen was no mere survivor. He understood that the strength of a small state lay not in its gold, but in the speed of its soldiers and the faith of its people. He began where others hesitated, with reform. The boyars, long accustomed to defying their princes, found their privileges curtailed. The army was remade into two bodies: the austere Mica, a standing force of professionals armed with crossbows, lances, and early firearms, and the austere Mare, a levy of free peasants summoned in times of peril. From monastery to border fort, new foundries rang with the sound of hammers forging cannon. Stone towers rose along the Siret, the Prout, and the Nesta, each a tooth in a defensive jaw meant to bite down on any invader. Stephen's Moldavia was not rich, but it was disciplined. A network of scouts and messengers threaded through the forests. Riders could carry orders from Suceava to the Black Sea in 3 days. Priests blessed the soldiers before each campaign, sprinkling holy water over helmets still dented from earlier wars. War and faith became indistinguishable, the liturgy of survival. The prince himself lived simply. Chroniclers wrote that he ate from wooden bowls, rode without ostentation, and prayed before each battle. Yet the restraint masked ferocity. In his first decade of rule, he defeated the Hungarians at Bayer in 1467 AD, wounding their king, Matthias I. 3 years later, he crushed the Tatars of the Golden Horde at Lipnik, ending their raids into his northern lands. When Wallachian armies invaded in 1471, he drove them back across the Danube. Every victory was a warning that Moldavia, though small, could not be swallowed whole. Each campaign strengthened his legend. To his soldiers, he was the voivode who rode at the front. To his enemies, the prince who struck from the fog. Even his allies in Poland and Hungary treated him warily, unsure whether they were hosting a saint or a strategist. His council, Puris, Arbor, Haru, Gangur, advised caution, but Stephen's instinct was always motion. If the Ottomans built a bridge, he burned it. If they demanded tribute, he delayed payment until the message itself felt like defiance. And yet, he was not reckless. For a decade, he paid Mehmed II the required gold, calling it the price of peace. But peace purchased with coin is a wound that never heals. As the Ottoman armies pressed further into the Balkans, their envoys arrived in Suceava, bearing new demands for ports, for passage, for obedience. Stephen answered with silence. Then he began to build fortresses closer to the frontier. In 1465 AD, he seized Chilia, a fortified port at the Danube Delta, coveted by every power in the region. It gave Moldavia a window onto the Black Sea and denied the Ottomans an eastern gateway into his realm. Mehmed's response was polite at first, a diplomatic protest, followed by the quiet preparation of armies. Stephen knew what that politeness meant. He had seen it before in Hungarian letters, written just before an invasion. By the early 1470s, the Moldavian court was a paradox, monks copying psalters by candlelight, while engineers tested new bombards in the courtyards outside. Each monastery was both sanctuary and redoubt. At Putna, where the prince planned his burial one day, masons worked by torchlight to finish the stone walls that would shelter relics and soldiers alike. He often walked among them, not as ruler, but as companion. These stones, he told Arbora, must outlast our bones. For all his piety, Stephen was no idealist. He maintained envoys in Buda and Krakow, bargaining for aid he knew would never come. The kings of the north praised his courage, but counted their own borders first. The papal legates sent him medals and words. None sent armies. Only the Venetians, bound by their rivalry with the Ottomans, offered occasional coin and spies. The prince accepted both, but he trusted only his own eyes. When the first Ottoman raids struck the southern marches, Stephen rode out himself to meet them. He fought not for glory, but for information, to learn the patterns of the empire's war machine. The Janissaries moved in precise squares, he observed. Their Sipahi cavalry sought open ground for the charge. He gave them none. Battles were fought in forests where muskets fouled in the damp and ambushes turned clearings into graves. Each skirmish became a rehearsal for the greater storm he knew was coming. The Moldavian winter of 1474 settled early, freezing the rivers solid. Farmers repaired walls instead of ploughing, knowing the empire to the south was gathering. In the nights before Christmas, Stephen held council in Suceava. His captains sat wrapped in fur, steam rising from their cloaks. On the table before them lay a map drawn on rough parchment, marked with rivers and crosses, the sign of faith and of ambush. "They will come through Wallachia," Stephen said quietly. "They will march through snow, hungry and proud. pride breaks faster than iron. He pointed to a valley near Vaslui, where the Barlad River wound through bog and wood. The ground there was treacherous even in summer. In winter it became a maze of mud and mist. "Here," he said, "we will answer empire with fog." Purus crossed himself. Arbor smiled grimly. The council understood. Every field in Moldavia was a weapon if one knew how to use it. Outside, the wind howled through the frozen battlements, carrying the distant sound of church bells. Each toll echoed like a heartbeat against the walls. From the monastery towers, the sentries could already see flares burning along the southern horizon. Ottoman scouts probing the borderlands. The war that everyone had feared was no longer a rumor. It was a light in the night sky. In Constantinople, Mehmed II's emissaries prepared their reports. They spoke of Moldavia as a wilderness of stubborn men and broken promises. In Suceava, the prince knelt in the monastery chapel and whispered prayers for those same men. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, not as a gesture of defiance, but as recognition of the task ahead. Faith and iron were the twin pillars on which his realm stood. One would have to hold when the other faltered. The dawn that followed was cold and silent. Stephen rode from the citadel before the bells ceased ringing, his breath clouding in the morning air. Beneath the hooves of his horse, the frost cracked like glass. Around him, the snow-covered hills lay still, waiting for the thunder of armies. Somewhere beyond those hills, the empire of Mehmed II was already in motion. Soon the Moldavian fortress would be tested again, yet it was not stone or mortar that would be proven. It was the will of its maker. Winter's retreat brought no comfort to Moldavia. The snow melted into black mud that swallowed hooves and wheels, turning roads into rivers. On the borderlands, shepherds vanished, and merchants whispered of Ottoman scouts appearing deeper into Wallachia each week. Even the wind seemed to carry rumor, the premonition of an army that had not yet come, but was already imagined in every frightened prayer. Inside Suceava's stone heart, Stephen the Great walked the corridors with the wary patience of a man who had lived too long with danger. His counselors came and went. Puris, cautious as winter sunlight. Arbor, whose temper burned quicker than tinder. And Haru, silent and fatalistic, the soldier who saw omens in every shifting wind. They brought reports of Ottoman spies disguised as traders, of villages stripped bare, of alliances turning to dust. The prince listened, but said little. He knew the pattern of empires. First came the envoys with their polite demands, then the soldiers who made those demands law. His refusal to pay the annual tribute, 10,000 ducats once offered for peace, had transformed Moldavia from vassal to target. To Mehmed II, the silence from the north was rebellion. To Stephen, it was the last language of dignity. In Constantinople, the court seethed with calculations. Treasurers measured losses from the Kaffa-Krakow trade route. Broken convoys, empty warehouses, gold vanished along the Dniester. Mehmed's counselors urged vengeance disguised as order. The Sultan's justice, they called it. The Sultan himself spoke only once. "Let Rumelia march," he said, and his word became law. Hadam Suleiman Pasha, governor of the Balkan provinces, received the decree. A veteran of Shkoda, he understood what it meant to turn imperial ambition into movement. He was ordered to assemble the armies of Rumelia, Janissaries, Sipahis, Akancha raiders, Azap infantry, and Balkan auxiliaries, and march north when the frost broke. Wallachia's prince, Basarab Lyota, would guide them through his territory, eager to prove loyalty by betraying kin. Stephen's country began its own preparation. quieter, but no less methodical. The Oestia Mica, his standing force, drilled on the plains near Vaslui, while the Ostia Mare, the peasant levy, dismantled bridges, emptied barns, and hid livestock in the forests. "We shall starve them before we strike them," Stephen told his council. "Their hunger will fight for us." Messengers galloped along the forest tracks, spreading coded orders to the watchtowers. 2 beacons if Ottoman scouts crossed the border, 3 if the invasion began. Across Moldavia, churches turned into armories. Monks blessed blades instead of plows. The monasteries became fortresses of prayer and powder. Intelligence was the prince's sharpest weapon. His spies in Wallachia fed false reports to Ottoman agents, tales of famine, mutiny, and sickness. Suleiman's scouts brought these rumors south, and the Pasha believed what he wished to believe, that the northern realm was collapsing on its own. "Let them think us broken," Stephen said. "The trap is strongest when the hunter feels safe." Still, he sought allies. Envoys rode west with appeals written in the language of faith. In Krakow, Poland's King Casimir offered condolences but no men. In Buda, King Matthias I praised Stephen's courage while guarding his own borders. Even the Pope, who called him Athleta Christi, sent only a letter of blessing. The Christian world preferred admiration to assistance. Only Venice extended a hidden hand. Venetian merchants, stung by Ottoman sieges on the Adriatic, sent money and a few engineers. Some Hungarian mercenaries arrived seeking fortune. By autumn of 1474, the Moldavian banners counted nearly 40,000 souls. A patchwork of peasants, Zekeli infantry from Transylvania, Polish cavalry, and a hardened corps of native soldiers. They lacked splendor, but not resolve. Far south, Constantinople moved as if guided by a single heartbeat. Forges in Edirne poured bronze for new cannon. Dockyards along the Black Sea prepared barges for the Danube crossing. Suleiman reported that his strength might reach 60,000 men, perhaps more if the Wallachians joined promptly. Mehmed's reply was cold. "Bring me the voivode in chains. Alive, if convenient." As frost crept over the Balkans, Suleiman's army gathered around Sofia, a forest of tents stretching beyond sight. Drums marked the hours. The Janissaries drilled in rigid squares. The Sipahi cavalry tested their horses on frozen fields. Engineers built bridges from pine and prayer. Beneath the sound of marching rose an unease that no discipline could silence. Too many remembered the hunger of Shkoda and the mountains that devoured armies whole. In the north, Moldavian scouts watched the distant glow of campfires and the glint of armor through fog. When their reports reached Suceava, Stephen only nodded. "So it begins," he murmured. Orders followed swiftly. Civilians to retreat into the mountains, wells to be poisoned, storehouses burned. By the time the invaders crossed the Danube, the land would greet them with emptiness. The first clashes came near Galatsi, sharp, brief engagements in the mist. Ottoman advance parties met Moldavian riders, who struck like shadows and vanished into woods. Behind them, villages burned to deny the enemy shelter. Priests remained behind to bless the dying. "Better ashes than chains," one murmured as he barred his church door. By December, Suleiman's host reached the river. Ice floes drifted beneath a pale moon, while engineers hammered pontoons into place. The sound carried across the water like the beating of war drums. On the far bank, Moldavian sentries watched from the forests, torches cupped in their hands. The invasion had begun. In his citadel, Stephen climbed the watchtower at dusk. From that height, the world seemed small, rivers like threads, hills like sleeping beasts. Somewhere beyond that darkness, tens of thousands advanced under Mehmed's banners. The prince felt the wind cut his face and whispered, "Let the land remember its duty." He had chosen the ground. Now he would teach the invader how to drown in it. That night, the council met for the last time before war. The chamber smelled of resin and smoke. Maps lay spread beneath flickering lamps. "They will cross through Wallachia within a fortnight," Stephen said. "They will find no food, no prisoners, no mercy. When they reach the valley, we will be waiting." Puris leaned forward. "At Vaslui?" The voivode's eyes gleamed in the half-light. "There, where the river bends, where the fog is thickest, the empire will walk into its own grave." Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle and ceaseless. It covered the fields, the towers, and the roads where armies would soon tread. Each flake whispered of patience, as if the earth itself conspired with its prince. By dawn, the frontier was white and silent. Far away, the Ottoman columns moved north through Wallachia, confident in their strength. None yet understood that the northern land had already turned itself into a weapon, one made of hunger, cold, and faith. At the edge of winter, the empire began to move. From the fortresses of the Balkans to the markets of Edirne, drums sounded as if the land itself had remembered its master's command. Roads once used for trade, now filled with regiments and supply wagons. Across snow-dark valleys, the banners of the Crescent unfurled against a pale sky, their silk catching the light like fire in water. Hadam Suleiman Pasha, governor of Rumelia and servant to Mehmed II, directed this awakening with measured precision. He was a soldier of discipline rather than glory, a man who understood that conquest depended less on passion than on logistics. When the Sultan's seal reached him, he left the half-finished siege of Shkodër and turned north towards Sofia, where the armies of Europe's most formidable power gathered beneath his standard. By late autumn, the city was surrounded by tents and the smell of forge smoke. Armorers hammered out links of chainmail. Engineers tested the new cannon barrels cast in Edirne. Scribes copied the lists of rations, mounts, and prisoners to be taken. The army that formed around Suleiman was a world unto itself, a moving city of men, beasts, and iron. At its heart stood the Janissary Corps, the disciplined center of the Ottoman system. Each author drilled twice daily, firing matchlocks into straw targets until the valley filled with smoke. Around them assembled the Sipahi cavalry, land-holding warriors in lamellar armor, whose pride was as sharp as their scimitars. In the vanguard ranged the Akunchu, light horsemen who carried little besides their bows and their hunger for plunder. Behind them trudged the Azaps, barefoot infantry who built bridges, dug trenches, and filled the dead silence between battles with muttered prayers. From the mountains of Bosnia came auxiliary troops hardened by siege, and from the plains of Bulgaria came engineers who could raise a pontoon bridge in a single day. When the columns were counted, even the Pasha doubted the scribes' totals. 60,000 at least, perhaps as many as 90. With Wallachian contingents promised by Prince Basarab Lyota, the host might reach 100,000. The numbers were less important than the certainty that it would be enough. The army began its march at dawn, a slow pulse of movement across the frozen earth. Hooves struck sparks from the ice. Wheels screamed against the ruts of the road. The route led northeast through the valleys of the Balkan Range, then down toward the Danube, where the empire's borders met the Christian frontier. Even before the first bridge was crossed, men fell ill from the cold, and horses stumbled under the weight of guns still slick with frost. Yet discipline held. The Janissaries marched in silence, their pace unbroken. In every village they passed, the inhabitants watched from shuttered doorways. Some offered bread, others fled into the woods. Those who remained saw more than an army. They saw empire made flesh, its rhythm that of inevitability. South of the Danube, Suleiman paused at Vidin to gather his Wallachian allies. Basarab Lyota greeted him with banners raised and a retinue too large to be trusted. Behind the smiles lay fear. Behind the feasts lay calculation. The Wallachian prince knew that serving the Sultan might save his throne for a season, but never for a lifetime. Even so, he brought 15,000 men to the muster, their armor patched, their loyalty uncertain. They marched at the tail of the Ottoman columns, a shadow following its owner. By the first week of December 1474 AD, the army reached the river. The Danube was frozen in places, its surface glistening like dull silver beneath the winter sun. Engineers chopped channels through the ice, anchoring pontoons to create a bridge, half timber, half miracle. When the first cannons rolled across, the ice groaned but held. The army followed, a serpent of men stretching for miles. Once on the northern bank, they entered Wallachia, where the villages were stripped bare, an omen of what lay ahead. The march north through Lyota's territory was a trial of endurance. Wind tore at the tents, snow blinded the guides. Every step forward left bodies behind. At night, the sky burned with the orange of their campfires. By day, the columns advanced through silence so complete that even the creak of harness leather sounded unnatural. Scouts sent ahead returned with grim news. The frontier of Moldavia was empty. Fields destroyed, wells poisoned, bridges burned. Suleiman pressed on. He had been ordered to crush resistance, not to study it. For 30 days the army struggled through a wilderness that seemed to reject it. The Akanchu who rode ahead found only ghosts, abandoned huts, frozen tracks, and in one place, a row of wooden crosses freshly carved. They joked that the northern prince must be too frightened to fight, yet their laughter dimmed when the first supply wagons overturned in the mud and the oxen refused to move. Hunger came quickly. The empire had planned for battle, not for absence. Soldiers stripped bark from trees to boil into soup. The sick were left behind with prayers none believed. Still, the Pasha ordered the march to continue. To halt was to admit weakness, and weakness was a language the Sultan never forgave. By the turn of the year, the great host reached the Prut River. The thaw had begun early, softening the banks into mire. Horses sank to their knees. Artillery wheels vanished into the mud. The soldiers cursed the land that fought without showing its face. To the north, Stephen watched from the hills. His scouts returned daily with tidings of exhaustion, spreading through the invaders' ranks. He allowed them no rest. At night, small bands of riders slipped behind the Ottoman lines, attacking supply trains and burning forage wagons. In daylight, the enemy saw only smoke on the horizon, never the men who lit it. It was war fought through echoes and shadows, the kind of war the voivode had mastered. Meanwhile, the Moldavian population withdrew deeper into the mountains. Fortified monasteries sheltered families, livestock, and relics. What could not be carried was destroyed. The land became a deliberate void, a weapon sharpened by famine and frost. In the Ottoman camps, morale waned. The Janissaries muttered about cursed ground. The Sipahi quarreled over rations, and the Akunshi, once eager for plunder, found nothing to steal. Even Suleiman, whose discipline was legend, felt the strain. Yet retreat was unthinkable. He pushed northward, convinced that one decisive engagement would restore his men's courage. When scouts reported untouched villages near Vaslui, fields unburned, roofs intact. He saw it as a sign that fortune had turned. Against the advice of his officers, he ordered the army forward, intending to rest there before striking at Suceava. The ground seemed firm enough, the fog no thicker than before. Only the ravens circling above hinted that the valley ahead was no haven. Through January's first days, the column advanced across land that swallowed sound. Drums faded within 100 paces. Voices vanished into mist. The Pasha could see scarcely a few ranks ahead, yet he pressed on. Behind him, the long train of the empire wound through the fog. Janissaries marching in ordered silence, Sipahi leading half-starved horses, Wallachians trudging behind under banners they no longer recognized. The earth quaked faintly under their weight, as if the valley itself exhaled beneath them. Far ahead, Stephen's sentinels watched from the tree line. They saw the smoke of countless campfires drifting like ghosts above the marsh, and knew that the trap was closing. Orders passed in whispers. Positions were taken in the darkness. Across the frozen ridges, cannon were dragged into hiding. Suleiman's vanguard reached the valley of the Barlad River by the evening of January 9th, 1475. The meadows were flooded, the air heavy with mist. He ordered his troops to make camp and prepare for engagement at dawn. Somewhere beyond the fog, he imagined, the northern prince waited with the last fragments of his army, a final gesture before inevitable defeat. Night fell over the bivouac. Fires flickered weakly against the damp, and the wind carried faint sounds of movement from the woods, a horse's snort, a drumbeat muffled by distance. None could tell whether they were real. The Empire's soldiers slept in armor, their weapons close, unaware that the ground beneath them had already been chosen by their enemy as the site of reckoning. Beyond the ridges, Stephen stood beside his captains, the cold air turning his breath to smoke. He had watched the Empire stumble through his desolate country and now saw it settling into the valley exactly as planned. Around him, the men of the austere mica waited in silence, hands on sword hilts damp with frost. The campaign of 1475 had begun, not with the clash of armies, but with the quiet surrender of an empire to terrain it did not understand. The next sunrise would decide whether the valley of Vaslui would be remembered as a field of deliverance or a graveyard for those who followed the Crescent north. Dawn rose pale and soundless above the Barlad Valley. What light reached the ground came filtered through fog, a thick grey veil that turned the campfires of Suleiman Pasha's army into scattered embers floating in air. Beneath that shroud, tens of thousands stirred to the slow rhythm of drums muffled by snow. The Empire had come north expecting resistance. Instead, it found absence. The day before, the Ottoman vanguard had crossed the final ridge and seen what appeared to be a haven. Fields unburned, huts intact, a river crossing wide enough for artillery. It seemed, to weary eyes, a promise of rest. Suleiman took it as a sign that his fortune had returned. He did not see the stillness for what it was, the silence of a trap waiting to close. His officers gathered before dawn. Steam rose from their armor as they bent over the map spread upon a makeshift table. The plan was simple: cross the Barlad, secure the villages ahead, and push toward Vaslui by midday. Scouts spoke of no enemy in sight. The Pasha nodded once, and the drums began again. The signal to move. The first ranks stepped into the fog and vanished. Beyond them, the valley stretched for miles, bordered by low hills and thick forest. The snowmelt had turned the meadows into sucking marsh. Each pace forward left a print that filled with water. Still, the army advanced. Janissaries first, Sipahis, and Wallachians behind, the baggage train trailing like a wound that never closed. From the hills to the north, Stephen watched. His captains stood beside him, wrapped in furs, their faces carved by cold. Below them, the Empire's column moved as if sleepwalking. The fog blunted all sound, except the rhythmic thud of boots and the groaning of wheels. Stephen could see where the ground dipped into swamp and where the bridge, the only bridge, crossed the river. His engineers had weakened its timbers under cover of darkness. It would bear men, but not salvation. For weeks, his people had worked to make the land itself an accomplice. Wells had been poisoned, roads torn open, and food stores emptied. The Moldavian peasants had withdrawn into the forests, taking livestock and grain with them. Behind each hill waited an ambush line. Beneath the snow, pits had been dug to swallow horses. The austere Micah, his professional host, lay hidden in the woods on both sides of the valley, while the austere mayor and the Sekeli auxiliaries crouched near the riverbanks, ready to strike when the mist thickened. Stephen did not give speeches. He simply stood, gloved hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the valley. Around him, the air smelled of wet pine and gunpowder. When the first distant trumpet sounded, the Empire calling itself to advance, he only nodded. Below, the Ottoman army spread like dark ink across the white ground. The Janissaries moved with machine precision, each rank following the beat of the kettle drums that echoed dimly through fog. Sipahi cavalry struggled to keep formation. The marsh sucked at their horses' hooves, and their polished armor dulled beneath the drizzle. Wallachian auxiliaries muttered among themselves, eyes darting toward the woods. Suleiman rode at the center, wrapped in furs, his beard rimed with frost. To his left trudged the artillery, oxen groaning under bronze cannon too heavy for the roads. Progress slowed to a crawl. Men fell behind, swallowed by mist, their curses lost in the grey. The Pasha sent riders forward to find solid ground, but none returned. The valley had no edges, only depth. By midday, the army had advanced 3 miles and gained nothing. The scouts began to report phantom movements, shadows flitting among the trees, flashes of steel, the glint of a crossbow bolt. Suleiman dismissed them as nerves, but unease spread faster than orders. The men could feel eyes upon them. Then the first ambush struck. From the right-hand forest came a whisper of motion, followed by the hiss of arrows. Janissaries fell, their bodies half vanishing into the mud. Before the Pasha could rally his ranks, another volley came from the left, this time from unseen archers who vanished as soon as they fired. The fog thickened until friend and enemy were indistinguishable. Stephen's forces melted away before counterattack, drawing the invaders deeper into the valley. Every step forward seemed to promise engagement. Every promise dissolved into emptiness. The Ottomans fired blindly into the mist. The crack of arquebuses echoed back from the hills, each echo sounding like a new enemy. By afternoon, the Empire's long column had stretched so thin that its rear no longer knew where its vanguard stood. The bridge groaned under the weight of reinforcements still crossing. Suleiman, believing the main Moldavian host lay just beyond the next ridge, ordered a full advance. The command rippled through ranks already trembling with exhaustion. At that moment, the first cannon, hidden on the hills, opened fire. The shells crashed into the swamp near the bridge, scattering men and horses alike. The riverbank exploded into chaos as timbers splintered and water surged through the gaps. The bridge held, barely, but panic rippled backward through the line. From his vantage, Stephen could see the confusion unfolding exactly as planned. He raised a gloved hand, and a signal banner unfurled from the hilltop behind him. Horns sounded once, a low, rolling note that carried through the fog. Across the valley, other horns answered. The second phase began. Moldavian light cavalry burst from the woods on both flanks, loosing arrows and pulling back before the Sipahi could regroup. The Janissaries tried to form ranks, but the ground betrayed them. Every step forward was swallowed by mud. Cannon fire continued from the hills, striking at the bridge in the rear. In the mist, the Empire's order dissolved. Through the confusion, Suleiman tried to impose discipline. He called for his standard, ordered his Janissaries to push forward, and shouted for the Sipahi to outflank the enemy. None could see where the enemy was. Voices answered from the fog, commands in Turkish, then in a foreign tongue, and no one could tell which were true. As evening approached, the wind shifted, carrying with it the low rumble of Moldavian drums. Their rhythm was irregular, almost mocking, echoing from every direction. Trumpets followed, not imperial ones, but rough, handmade horns that blared from within the trees. The sound confused direction itself. Men turned their weapons towards shadows and fired at smoke. By nightfall, the Ottoman campfires were burning in isolation, each surrounded by a small circle of frightened men who could not see the others. Suleiman ordered the drums silenced, hoping to hear where his enemy lay. The silence that followed was worse. In the woods, Stephen's captains prepared for the morning. Arbor directed the Shekeli detachments to flood parts of the meadow by diverting the river. Puras rode the lines, ensuring no torchlight betrayed their positions. The voivode himself walked among his soldiers, his boots sinking into the cold mire. He spoke little, only words of caution, not glory. His men understood that patience, not fervor, would win this war. The fog thickened again as darkness deepened. Across the valley, the Empire's soldiers shivered under wet cloaks. The Janissaries prayed aloud, their voices swallowed by mist. Horses screamed somewhere unseen. The bridge creaked under unseen movement, more reinforcements arriving too late. Suleiman lay awake in his command tent, listening. He could hear water running beneath the mud, the groan of armor, the distant crack of branches snapping under unseen feet. The enemy was close, too close. Yet his maps told him nothing, and the stars were hidden. On the hills above, Stephen gazed down at the faint glow of the Ottoman fires, each a trembling point in the grey. He imagined the fear those lights concealed, the endless weight of an empire trapped in a valley that refused to give it footing. The land itself seemed to breathe with him, slow and deliberate. When the eastern horizon began to pale, the fog did not lift. It thickened. The river's surface gleamed faintly under the dawn, and the Ottoman army stirred once more, unaware that every path before them led deeper into the snare. The land had done its part. Now the killing would begin. Morning broke over the Barlad Valley, though no one saw it. The fog lay so thick that the sun seemed a rumour, its light filtering through like the glow of embers buried in ash. The Ottoman camp stirred to life, but not to order. Men stumbled between tents that had half sunk into mud, their breath steaming in the cold air. The kettle drums that usually summoned formation beat faintly, as if the empire itself had lost conviction. Suleiman Pasha rose from a night without sleep. His eyes were rimmed red. His hands shook from cold and fury. Somewhere ahead, beyond the mist, he was certain Stephen waited, that elusive prince who had turned the north into a maze of ghosts. The Pasha's patience was a thread pulled taut. He would break this silence by force. Trumpeters sounded the advance. Columns formed where they could. The Janissaries took their place at the centre, their standards damp with dew. The Sipahi gathered on the flanks, their horses restless and skittish in the fog. Behind them groaned the long tail of baggage wagons and broken artillery, the Empire's lifeblood sinking inch by inch into the marsh. From the hills to the north, hidden behind frost-coated pines, Stephen watched. His soldiers crouched among the trees, cloaks drawn tight against the cold. The voivode said nothing. His captains, Puris, Arbor, and Haru, stood nearby, each knowing the plan by heart. The valley below would become a funnel of death. Once the enemy had entered, there would be no retreat, no breath, no salvation. During the night, Moldavian engineers had dammed a tributary of the Barlad. At dawn, they broke it open. The river surged into the meadows, turning the valley floor into shallow, sucking pools. The Empire's army, already mired in mud, now marched through water that swallowed their boots and pulled at the hooves of their horses. The trap was not built in walls, but in illusion. Archers hid among the trees, their arrows wrapped in cloth to silence their flight. Crossbowmen knelt behind reeds along the flooded banks. Cannon crews crouched on the ridges, their barrels veiled with pine branches. When the wind shifted, the smell of powder drifted through the fog, unnoticed by those it would destroy. By mid-morning, the first ranks of the Ottoman vanguard reached the river crossing. They found the bridge, repaired overnight by Suleiman's engineers, still standing, though creaking ominously. Beyond it, the valley opened into a field that seemed empty. No sound of war drums, no banners, no sign of the enemy. The Pasha mistook quiet for opportunity. He ordered the Janissaries forward. The drums thundered once, and the line advanced. They moved cautiously, matchlocks raised, eyes straining through mist that seemed to thicken with each step. The water reached their knees. From the woods, unseen watchers marked their progress, waiting for the signal. On the ridges, Stephen lifted a hand. A red banner unfurled behind him, and the first cannon roared. The shot struck the bridge, splintering its side. A moment later, the second blast sent shards of timber spinning into the air. The structure held for now, but the message was clear. The way back was dying. Arrows hissed from the flanks. The Empire's forward ranks faltered as men fell into the icy water, their armor dragging them down. From the tree line came a new sound, the deep twang of crossbows and the crack of handguns fired blind into the mist. The Janissaries fired back, their own shots flaring red in the fog, lighting faces twisted in confusion. Suleiman urged his cavalry forward, shouting for them to push through. The Sipahi obeyed, galloping into ground that betrayed them. Horses floundered, sank, screamed. Riders tried to reform lines but found no footing. On the right flank, the Wallachian auxiliaries, half-starved, half-doubtful, wavered. Some turned their mounts and fled toward the bridge, only to find it buckling under the weight of retreat. Stephen signaled again. From the western ridge, Moldavian light cavalry burst into motion, striking the exposed flanks. Their arrows cut through fog and panic alike. On the eastern side, the Zekali infantry surged from concealment, charging with axes and spears. The Empire's disciplined formations dissolved into chaos, men colliding in blindness. The air was alive with noise, not the clean sound of battle, but a cacophony of confusion. The splash of bodies, the crack of timber, the muffled roar of guns firing through fog. Above it all came the beating of Moldavian drums, irregular and mocking, echoing from every direction at once. To the invaders, it seemed as though the earth itself had turned hostile. In the center, Suleiman fought to restore order. His aides tried to relay commands, but sound carried strangely in the mist. Orders shouted to the left were heard by no one. Signals from the rear arrived too late. When he attempted to rally his Janissaries for a forward push, cannon fire from the northern ridge tore into his flank. The Empire's precision, its greatest strength, had become its prison. Arba's detachment advanced through the trees, crossbows replaced by sabres. The water reached their thighs, the cold numbed their feet, yet they moved with purpose, striking isolated pockets of Ottoman infantry before vanishing again. The forest itself seemed to devour the Empire's men, one handful at a time. Meanwhile, on the southern slope, Puris's archers kept up their barrage, each volley measured by rhythm rather than sight. They could not see the enemy, only hear the chaos below. Screams, splashes, the metallic rattle of panicked horses. The fog turned sound into geography. By midday, the Ottoman army had lost its coherence. The front still fought, unaware the rear had already begun to collapse. Supplies burned behind them. The bridge was now impassable. Suleiman's lieutenants begged him to withdraw while a path remained. The Pasha refused, certain that one more charge would break the Moldavian lines. Stephen waited until that charge began. He watched the Empire commit its final strength into the flooded valley, its banners barely visible through the mist. Then, with quiet precision, he raised his arm one last time. From the high ridge behind him, the heavy cavalry, the boyar guard, thundered down the slope. Their horses struck the mud like an avalanche. At their head rode the voivode himself, sword drawn, cloak snapping in the cold wind. The impact was catastrophic. The Ottoman rear, already panicked, disintegrated. Those who turned to fight found nowhere to stand. Those who fled drowned in the rising waters. The Moldavian cavalry drove deep into the enemy's center, cutting through disordered ranks. Arrows followed them, fired blind but sure. Somewhere in the chaos, Suleiman's standard fell. The Empire's heart faltered. When the fog shifted briefly, the valley revealed its shape, a wound filled with smoke and bodies. The river ran dark with silt and blood. Across that landscape, the Sultan's proud army broke apart in convulsions of terror. Stephen pulled his horse to a halt on a low ridge and looked down. The drums ceased. The wind carried the faint, dying clang of armor. His men continued their work, not in frenzy, but in grim efficiency. It was not victory yet. It was extermination. By evening, the fog thickened again, hiding the dead from the living. The sound of combat dwindled to isolated cries. Suleiman, wounded and desperate, ordered the remnants of his guard to hold the bridge, but it was gone. Some tried to swim the river. The current took them. Others fled into the forests, where they vanished as surely as if the earth had swallowed them. The valley grew quiet. Smoke drifted low over the water, mingling with mist. The once ordered army of the Sultan had become a memory, erased almost as soon as it was made. Stephen dismounted. Mud clung to his boots. Around him, the faces of his captains were pale with exhaustion and disbelief. They had seen empires before, but never one undone so completely. Night descended. Fires were lit on the ridges, not for warmth, but to find the wounded. The smell of powder and wet soil hung in the air. Beneath the smoke, the barlad flowed slowly, carrying away fragments of armor, broken spears, and the silence of those who would never rise again. The battle was not over, but the outcome was. The valley of Vaslui, once a quiet stretch of meadow and marsh, had earned a new name among the living, the Valley of Death. January 10th, 1475. A.D. Dawn tried to rise and failed. The fog in the Barlad Valley thickened into a substance men could breathe and choke on, a grey wall that made each soldier a stranger to the next. Frost glassed the reeds. The river moved like dull iron. Somewhere within that whiteness, trumpets throbbed a slow, misleading pulse. Suleiman Pasha sent the signal to advance. Kettle drums answered, a heartbeat swallowed at once by mist. The Janissary center stepped off first, matchlocks cradled, blades at the belt, officers' staves tapping cadence that no one could see. To either side, Sipahi squadrons urged uneasy horses through sucking ground, nostrils flaring at a smell of wet powder drifting from the unseen hills. Behind, the long tail of baggage, guns, and Wallachian auxiliaries struggled forward over a bridge already complaining under the weight of empire. From the northern ridge, the trap watched itself being filled. The voivode stood with his captains among frost-glazed pines, every branch beaded with water. Below, ranks dissolved into smears. He raised one gloved hand, a runner slipped away. The first of the hidden horns began its work. 3 notes, then silence, then 3 again, the sound floating from the western trees, though the men who blew them crouched due east. Direction lost meaning. Men wheeled toward echoes. The advance felt like drowning. Feet sank to the ankle, to the calf. Match cords hissed in damp fingers. When the first volley came, it came as a whisper, cloth-wrapped shafts that sighed out of the woods and nested in throats, shoulders, the naked seams between cuirass and collar. A few Janissaries fired back, their flames turning fog to amber for a heartbeat. The reply answered from nowhere, crossbow bolts heavy as insults, and then silence again, as if the valley were a mouth that had tasted blood and closed. Suleiman, somewhere in the middle distances, pushed the Sipahi on. He could not see his own standard. Orders went out and returned like birds that had lost their sky. On the right, Wallachian banners wavered, then drifted toward the bridge. The officers shouted. The words reached no ears that mattered. Ahead, the center pressed into water, now lifted by a slow current released in the night. Every step promised shallows and gave depth. A horn on the eastern slope sounded a charge. The Janissaries, mouths set beneath their moustaches, dressed ranks by faith more than sight, and moved to meet it. No enemy confronted them, only fog and the sharp, close slaps of arrows striking mud at their feet to make them think a line waited just beyond arm's reach. When the veterans halted, unwilling to spend powder on ghosts, gunfire cracked from the western ridge. A handful fell. Another handful. The Corps' famous steadiness did not break. It sheared, a careful thing, undone by inches. Cannons answered. The Empires dragged all night to the lip of the marsh, and found nothing. The shots ploughed water. Spray rose and fell. From the northern ridge, the valley finally received its first true roar. Moldavian guns, veiled in pine, spat iron toward the bridge. Timbers spat back splinters. Men stumbled on the decking, looked down, and seeing only white water and shards beneath, tried not to look again. Another round struck the far bank among the baggage. Oxen went to their knees, carts slipped sideways, and the narrow ribbon of retreat twisted into panic before any rider could forbid it. Light never properly arrived. Yet the day grew harsher. A second rhythm crept through the mist. Hand drums beat deliberately off the Empire's time, a second heartbeat in a hostile chest. The Sipahi tried to answer speed with speed, forcing their mounts upslope for footing that did not exist. Hooves slashed the skin of the marsh. Riders went down under their beasts. Lances became poles with which to lever bodies from mud that would not give them back. When they formed at last, thinned, angry, breathing steam, they found no enemy willing to be charged. The first counter-volley took the front rank in the eyes and throats, shafts falling out of a curtain that would not part. Stephen, no speech, no display, lowered his hand a finger's width. The Sekeli infantry surged from a snag of alder on the eastern side, short axes bright with rime. They struck not a line, but pockets, isolated knots of men who felt the hit only when iron arrived. A dozen were cut down, the Sekeli vanished, the mud closed, the fog forgot. On the western side, light horse cantered by in a broken crescent, loosing from the saddle, turning on a single hoofprint, loosing again. It was not a battle. It was an unraveling, an old garment pulled to threads by patient hands. The Pasha's aides, cloaks black with wet, pushed through bodies to bring steadiness where they could. Close by, a file of Janissaries knelt to fire, stood to step, knelt again, fighting the field rather than the foe. Their will did not break, the earth stole it. Behind them the drums faltered, and in the gap between beats, the horns in the trees sounded nearer. Midday had no colour. Sound carried strangely. A command on the right arrived to the left in a language nobody spoke. A plea at the rear died in the throats of men staring at the bridge. The baggage had clogged it utterly now. Tilted wagons gnawing the rail. A fallen gun carriage hung between spans. Oxus hide ropes screaming as they took weight they had never been meant to bear. When a crew tried to free the carriage with levers, the timbers answered with a long groan that froze every hand. Then the ridge lit again. A ball struck at the join, dead center. The plank split cleanly. The gap widened. A dozen men and one screaming horse showed for an instant, black on white, and were gone. The sound that followed, thousands learning in one breath that the way home no longer existed, rolled forward like weather. This was the moment the plan had waited for. The voivode lifted his arm fully now. On the crest behind him, the boyar guard, held all morning in a hard knot of muscle and frost, came forward shoulder to shoulder. That first step was a crack through ice. The second took the slope. The third became speed. The fourth was impact. They poured down the hill, not as riders, but as a falling thing, weight that learned to run. The valley felt it the way a hunted animal feels a hawk. They hit the rear where the Wallachian contingents had turned their faces toward the river. The first bodies went down and slid. Horses followed, banners folded beneath hooves. A wedge opened not by steel but by panic. The charge bit deeper, angling across the line toward the Janissary center. In the fog, the Ottoman corps saw their world go past them sideways and could not say which way was enemy, which way air. The guns along the ridge ceased. The friendly danger had moved into the gap, and crossbows took over, the bolt's flight audible as the rip of linen. On the eastern flank, Sekeli axes went to work again, not in a rush, but in a measured chopping, one stroke to the knee, one to the neck. 2 breaths. Step. Light horse threaded the spaces between, loosing arrows at a reach so close the feathering kissed faces. No shout rose from the defenders now. Breath belonged to survival. Suleiman tried to form a square, any square, around his standard. He found men who would do it. The first side set shields, the second brought spears down, the third closed its files, and the fourth slid in the mud and left a seam. The seam widened. A rider in a fur-lined cloak, no plume, no flourish, drove the seam open with his mount's breast and blade. Steel went up, steel went down. The square bent, not outward, but inward, a thing folding in on the space it could no longer defend. At the bridge, there was no bridge. Men plunged and came back choking, their mail coats dragging them like anchors. Others, stripped to shirts, tried the current and vanished. Teams hacked at the wreckage with axes and found only water. The river asked for names and learned none. Somewhere in that collapsing maze, the Pasha's voice still worked, He gathered a knot of veterans, the ones whose eyes measured distance rather than terror, and pushed toward the right in hopes of finding ground that would hold. A handful won it. The rest slipped back into the sucking cold. The standard went down. The hand that held it tried to rise and could not. The cloth lay on water, the crescent dark as blood. The valley breathed once, long and slow, and the empire exhaled men. They came away in streams that found every hollow and filled it. Where a stump offered height, fighters clung and swung until the crowd took them. Where a cart offered shelter, bolts found the gaps. Behind, on the ridge, the boyar guard checked, reformed, and drove again, less charge than tide. In front, the Janissary files that remained intact backed step by step, keeping their faces to the teeth. They did not run. They died, as though dying were a drill to be executed cleanly. The fog opened for a heartbeat. From the northern height, the whole design showed itself. River, marsh, broken causeway, black knots where men still fought, long pale streaks where men lay in water. Then the view closed, and the world returned to breath and touch. Leather strings slick with blood, a stirrup lost, the warm reek of a gelding's flank, the taste of powder on the tongue. Afternoon had no edge. The field thinned itself, sound scaled down from thunder to hammering to a vast, ragged whisper. The valley accepted what it had been given. Crows came down in confidence. The living did not see them. Near sunset, if there was sunset behind that lid, the horns ceased. Drums stopped answering drums. The last shot sounded like doors closing far down a corridor. In the sudden quiet, the snow began again. Flakes heavy enough to stick to hair, to lashes, to the black ribs of arquebus barrels cooling in hands that had forgotten to release them. On the ridge, the prince sat his horse and listened. He did not wait for cheer. None came. Cheer belongs to stories told later, in houses. What remained was work. Fires kindled not for warmth, but for search. Names called for men who could no longer answer. Mercy where mercy could be given, iron where it could not. Night, or what passed for it, took the valley. Torches limned shapes half in water. The river carried away splinters of plank and small, unclaimable things. The great host that had climbed the Balkans and crossed the Danube had met a piece of earth that refused to be conquered, and a mind that knew how to make earth fight. By the time stars returned, faint needles above a lid of cloud, the rout had begun at the edges and would, by morning, have a direction. Men who had believed themselves part of an unbreakable engine turned each for himself, slipping north, south, anywhere that was not here. The prince's riders were already moving, their hoofbeats muffled on soaked ground, their lanterns covered. What the valley had not finished, pursuit would. The day that never brightened had ended, and with it ended certainty. In the record books of empires, numbers would be written and rewritten. In the letters that followed, defeats would be explained by fog, bridges, chance. But the truth lay under a skin of snow. An army that had trusted order against a country that had learned to weaponize emptiness. Morning would show how far the broken pieces could run. For now the bar lad slid on, indifferent, carrying with it the last light from 1,000 extinguished torches. Night held the valley in its fist. The air was full of vapor, ash, and a strange quiet that no one could name. Where the Empire's banners had stood that morning, only scraps of cloth remained, snared on reeds, sunk in mud, or tangled in the limbs of drowned horses. The great host of Suleiman Pasha no longer resembled an army. It had become a river of the lost, moving without command or direction, spilling north and south in equal panic. The Moldavian horns began again, not in triumph, but in signal. Across the ridges, torches flashed once, twice, then vanished. Cavalry detachments mounted wordlessly and rode out into the mist. They were not pursuing an enemy that fought back. They were chasing fear itself. Each hoofbeat sent ripples through shallow water that glimmered with starlight and blood. Below, the remnants of the Ottoman force tried to flee toward the river crossing. They found nothing left to cross. The bridge had splintered beneath its own cargo hours earlier, and the barlad ran swollen with rain and corpses. Men tore doors from abandoned wagons, tried to paddle on shields, and were drawn under by the current. Others clung to one another in blind terror, their armor dragging them down. The icy water took them quietly, without drama. Behind them, fire spread among the camp wagons. A single Moldavian bombard had struck a powder cart before being silenced, and the explosion had rolled through the valley like a thunderclap. The glow of burning canvas flickered against the fog, revealing scenes that were almost still. Horses half submerged, Janissaries kneeling in prayer they could not finish. Wallachian auxiliaries throwing down weapons as if metal itself had betrayed them. Stephen's riders descended from the hills, not in lines, but in threads of motion, silent as smoke. They struck scattered clusters of men, broke them apart, and vanished again. The voivode had ordered no mercy. There was no room for prisoners on a field that could barely hold the living. To those who surrendered, the fog was answer enough. Suleiman Pasha's standard, once the spine of the army, now lay somewhere beneath the mud. The Pasha himself was carried from the field by a handful of guards, half wounded and half believing. Behind him, the empire's discipline collapsed into instinct, survival, flight, denial. Officers who had spent decades perfecting formation drills shouted at men who no longer remembered the language of command. By midnight, the Moldavian cavalry controlled the valley floor. They moved methodically, cutting down stragglers, capturing weapons, stamping out pockets of resistance before they could reform. In the half-light of burning wagons, the landscape resembled an open wound. The once orderly march of the Ottoman host had turned to a stampede of ghosts. The chase began at first light. Frost had hardened the ground, and the fog lifted just enough to reveal the scale of ruin. The voivode's troops swept southward in pursuit, following trails of broken pikes and discarded standards. The fleeing army scattered into the forests, leaving behind cannon half buried in ice. For 3 days, the pursuit continued. Moldavian horsemen hunted along the Siret and the lower Barlad, cutting down fugitives who thought distance meant safety. The countryside that had seemed empty before the battle now filled with the sound of slaughter. Wolves followed the column, patient and untroubled. Those few who reached Wallachia spread word that the world had ended. They spoke of fog that moved like a living thing, of forests that spat arrows, of a river that ate men whole. Their fear travelled faster than they did. Even Basarab Lyota, who had once sworn loyalty to the Sultan, fled south ahead of them, his banners hidden, his men refusing to turn back. On the ridges, Moldavian infantry stripped the dead and salvaged weapons. The cannons were hauled onto higher ground as trophies. When the fog cleared completely, the true magnitude of victory emerged. The valley was carpeted with bodies, thousands of them scattered in lines that still hinted at the formations they had once been. The river had turned sluggish with debris. In places, its banks steamed as the frost thawed over the dead. Stephen rode down from the hills at noon. His horse picked its way carefully through the wreckage. The air smelled of iron and wet ash. Here and there, wounded soldiers raised their hands. A few were granted the priest's blessing, before being left to the cold. The voivod said nothing. His captains followed in silence, their faces pale with disbelief. No one cheered. The noise of the crows was the only applause. Messengers rode out carrying word of the triumph. Letters would soon reach Krakow, Buda, and Rome. They would speak of 40,000 slain, of a host broken by faith and frost. The numbers would change with each retelling, but the awe would not. In the Moldavian camp that night, the priests sang the Te Deum over a valley that could no longer echo. While the victors gathered what the dead had left behind, the last fragments of the Empire's army stumbled toward the Danube. Starving, barefoot, haunted, they left behind their wounded and their cannon. In the frozen dawns that followed, peasants found them wandering the plains, soldiers without swords, pilgrims without destination. The chroniclers of the age would argue over the toll. Jan Długosz, in his Latin chronicle, wrote that 45,000 Turks had perished, calling it divine vengeance. The Venetian envoys repeated the figure with disbelief and admiration. Ottoman scribes, eager to soften the disaster, claimed fewer, describing the battle as a victory of terrain rather than men. Only one account came close to the truth: the silence that lingered after. Back in Suceava, the monasteries filled with refugees returning from the mountains. Bells rang for the living and the dead alike. The voivod refused to rest. He dispatched envoys carrying his victory letter across Christendom, written in the proud, formal Latin of princes. It proclaimed the deliverance of the faithful, the triumph of a small realm against a power that had called itself eternal. Every word carried the certainty of divine favor, and a hint of accusation for those who had refused to send aid. In Constantinople, days later, rumors reached the court before the messengers did. The Sultan's viziers debated the scale of loss. None dared speak the full number. Mehmed II, listening in his marble hall, said nothing. When the official report finally arrived, he read it without expression, then folded the parchment and handed it back. The courtiers swore later that the sound of the parchment creasing was louder than thunder. Back on the battlefield, the Moldavians worked for days to clear the dead. The riverbanks turned black where they burned the bodies to stave off plague. Smoke drifted north, visible for miles. Farmers returned to fields that would never yield harvest again. The valley was poisoned with salt, blood, and memory. When the fires had cooled, Stephen ordered the construction of a small chapel on a hill overlooking the river. It was built from stone taken from shattered cannon, the altar draped in a banner seized from the enemy. Priests consecrated the ground, though even they could not say whose souls they prayed for. The victory spread through Europe like light through stained glass. Chroniclers called it the greatest defeat the Ottomans had suffered since Ankara. In Rome, the Pope praised Stephen as Athleta Christi, champion of Christ. In Buda, Matthias I toasted him but sent no army. The glory was his alone, and so was the burden. For the survivors of the northern host, there was no return. Along the roads to the Danube, their bones would be found for years, marked by rusting weapons and broken standards. Traders crossing those plains whispered prayers as they passed, and the name of Vaslui became shorthand for annihilation. The valley itself lay quiet again by the spring thaw. Grass grew over the mounds where the dead had been burned, and the river resumed its steady course, pretending to forget. Yet every time the mist descended, travelers swore they could still hear drums beneath the water, faint, rhythmic, unending, the heartbeat of an empire that had marched into the north and found its grave. When the sun finally returned, It rose upon a valley that no longer belonged to the living. The fog had burned away, leaving behind a pale sky and a silence that felt unnatural. The Barlad moved sluggishly, its banks lined with the debris of empire, broken shields, helmets without heads, a single jeweled standard caught among the reeds. The snow had turned grey from ash. For 3 days, ravens had eaten without rest. Stephen the Great stood on a low ridge overlooking what had once been the battlefield. His horse's hooves sank into ground, softened by thaw and blood. Around him gathered the captains who had carried out his plan. Arbora, with his arm bound in linen, Puris still streaked with soot, Haru riding silent, his eyes fixed on the smoke below. None spoke. There was nothing left to say. The valley stank of iron and salt. Men moved slowly through the wreckage, dragging the wounded from puddles that had frozen and thawed too many times. Every now and then, a voice called out a name that no one answered. The survivors of the voivode's army, peasants, nobles, shekelis, Poles, worked side by side, turning the battlefield into a grave. Shovels struck frozen earth with dull thuds. Monks from nearby monasteries carried incense and sang psalms that disappeared into the cold wind. By noon, the prince dismounted. He walked among the bodies without retinue or display. The dead lay in tangled patterns that still hinted at order. Rows of Janissaries, heaps of sipahi, and a kunchu mixed with Moldavian peasants who had fallen in the same struggle. Near the river, he paused beside the carcass of a horse half buried in silt. Its rider's hand still clutched the reins. Stephen made the sign of the cross, not for the man's faith, but for his endurance. When the priests had finished their blessing, the voivode gave orders for burial. The Moldavian fallen were laid in shallow trenches and covered with earth. The rest were burned. The smoke rose straight into the calm air, forming a grey column that could be seen for miles. The valley that had swallowed an empire now offered itself to heaven as proof. At Suceava, bells tolled for the first time in months. Messengers galloped from the fortress carrying letters sealed with the prince's signet. The news travelled faster than the horses could be fed. Within weeks, it reached Krakow, Buda, Venice, and Rome. Each court received the same message, written in formal Latin and carried by trembling envoys. The Lord has granted victory to his servant. The armies of the Sultan have been destroyed in the valley of Vaslui. The cross stands unbroken. The chroniclers in Europe seized upon the story. In Poland, Jan Długosz described it as divine vengeance, writing that never since the days of the Moabites had such slaughter been seen. Venetian merchants, eager for Ottoman weakness, spread the tale in every port. Rome declared a day of thanksgiving. Pope Sixtus IV, moved by reports of faith and courage, named Stephen Athleta Christi, the champion of Christ. But beyond the papal praise, there came nothing more. No troops, no silver, no alliance. The West applauded from a safe distance. Within the principality, victory had another face. The monasteries overflowed with wounded. Food grew scarce. The winter dragged on. The peasantry returned to fields that had been stripped bare by their own torches. What had been saved from conquest now had to survive the peace. Even the victors carried the look of ghosts. They had won the right to starve in freedom. Stephen spent those days between the capital and the monasteries, riding through villages where smoke still clung to the air. The people knelt as he passed, murmuring blessings, offering loaves baked from the last of their flour. He accepted none. He had no use for praise. His mind was already turning southward toward the Sultan who would not forgive. In Constantinople, Mehmed II received the news with silence. The court chroniclers wrote that he did not rise from his seat, nor did he look at the messengers who brought the report. When they finished their account, he dismissed them and stared out across the Bosporus toward the unseen north. The empire, he said at last, would answer. But not yet. Even wrath requires preparation. Back in the north, the Moldavian host began to disband. Soldiers returned to their homes in the mountains and along the Rout. The foreign mercenaries departed with pockets full of plundered gold, carrying stories that would outgrow truth before they crossed the Carpathians. The Zekkales went last, leaving behind axes and a carved sign on the monastery gate, a sun rising from fog. Stephen ordered the captured artillery dragged to Suceava, where it stood displayed in the courtyard of the fortress, mute trophies of empire. He established a chapel on the hill above the river, built from the stones of shattered cannon, and dedicated it to St. John the New. Each year, priests would walk there in procession to remember the dead. Yet the valley itself remembered more than any man. The grass would never grow clean again. Winter ebbed slowly. When spring came, the rivers rose and carried away the last debris of battle, planks, weapons, bones polished smooth by water. The land began to heal, though the scars remained. In the monasteries, monks illuminated manuscripts describing the victory in letters of gold. Outside their walls, farmers sowed barley in soil still salted with ash. Across Christendom, Stephen's name became legend. Minstrels sang of the prince who had humbled the Sultan's army, and preachers invoked him from pulpits as proof that faith could still defeat power. Yet the man himself remained unchanged. Those who met him in later years wrote of a ruler whose eyes carried both fire and weariness, a man who spoke little and believed less in miracles than in vigilance. The victory had not made him arrogant. It had made him wary. He knew Mehmed II too well. The Sultan would not forget. Even as letters of congratulation arrived from Rome and Venice, scouts along the Danube reported new movements, fresh levies, new ships, the mustering of vassal princes. The empire was not destroyed, it was only humiliated. And humiliation is a hunger that does not fade. By summer, the valley of Vaslui had become a place of pilgrimage. Peasants came to gather relics from the field, arrowheads, splintered spears, fragments of armor, and carried them home as charms against evil. Soldiers who had survived returned to stand in silence before the chapel, listening to the river and wondering how many of their comrades slept beneath its banks. The fog still rose there on cold mornings, thick as wool, moving slowly over the marsh as if reluctant to leave. In the chronicles of Moldavia, the entry for that year was brief. In the month of January, our Lord Stephen defeated the armies of the Sultan in the valley of Vaslui. Many were killed, few escaped. God's mercy was with us. Nothing more was needed. The valley had already written its own scripture. As the seasons turned, life crept back to the borderlands. Traders resumed their routes. Blacksmiths reforged broken blades into tools. Yet every village carried its own litany of names. The bells that rang for Easter also tolled for the men who would never return. The victory had saved the country, but salvation, like conquest, demanded its tithe. On a spring evening, when the last snows melted from the hills, Stephen rode once more to the river. The water ran high, thick with silt. He dismounted at the edge and stood alone for a long while. There was no triumph in his stance, only fatigue, and the knowledge that peace, too, could be temporary. The fog would come again. The empire would come again. But for this brief season, the land was his, and the dead were at rest. Above him, the bells of the new chapel began to ring. their sound carried down into the valley, over the graves and the slow, dark water. It was not a song of victory nor of mourning, but something between, a voice for those who had given everything so that their homeland might remain its own. The valley listened, and for the first time since the battle, it did not answer with silence. In the marble quiet of Topkapi Palace, news of defeat arrived like a contagion. Couriers stumbled into the audience hall half-starved, their uniforms in tatters, their mouths choked with the dust of 1,000 lost men. When they spoke, they stammered. They said that Suleiman Pasha's host, Rumelia's pride, the Sultan's spear, was gone. No survivors worthy of counting, no trophies to send home, only fog, death, and shame. Mehmed II listened without moving. The courtiers who filled the hall kept their faces still, knowing that to breathe too loudly in such a moment was to tempt ruin. The Sultan's gaze remained fixed on the floor tiles, veins of white marble twisting like frozen rivers. His fingers traced the edge of the throne's armrest, a slow rhythm marking the distance between patience and wrath. The messengers finished their account. No one dared to speak. Then the Sultan rose. He walked to the window that overlooked the Bosporus, his silhouette framed by the pale winter light. The water below was calm, a silver mirror reflecting his empire's serenity, a serenity built upon fear. When he finally spoke, his voice carried like iron drawn from the forge. The land may devour armies, but it cannot devour empire. Moldavia will learn this. He dismissed the couriers, ordered them fed, and demanded new maps. For days, Constantinople held its breath. Drums in the Janissary barracks stopped beating. The call to prayer echoed through empty courtyards. Those close to the throne whispered that the Sultan's anger had gone cold, that the kind of fury that does not shout is the most terrible of all. Mehmed's fury was not chaos. It was calculation. He had built an empire not on temper, but on method, and he knew that vengeance, like steel, must be tempered before it strikes. He convened his viziers, his treasurers, and his war captains beneath the vaulted ceiling of the imperial council chamber. The doors were shut, the lamps burned low. They debated the disaster. Grand Vizier Mahmud Pasha spoke of exhaustion in the provinces, of winter and plague. Others blamed Suleiman for haste, for trusting terrain and false guides. A few dared to question the wisdom of marching in the dead of the year. Mehmed listened, his expression unreadable. When the debate began to turn upon itself, he lifted his hand and ended it. Suleiman is dead to me, he said. The North will remember his failure as a lesson. We will not repeat it. He turned to his cartographers. New maps unrolled across the marble table, inked lines tracing the rivers, the mountains, the valleys where empire had bled. Mehmed studied them as if reading scripture. The Danube, the Prut, the Siret, each became a vein to be reopened. He tapped the region near Suceava with a finger. Here, he said softly, we will cut deeper. The viziers understood what that meant. A campaign not of punishment, but of annihilation. In the months that followed, the empire bent itself toward revenge. Foundries in Edirne poured bronze for new cannon, larger and longer than those that had breached Constantinople's walls 20 years before. Shipwrights along the Black Sea built vessels for river transport to carry provisions and reinforcements. From Anatolia came new levies, men who had never seen snow, whose armor gleamed brighter than their courage. The Sipahi regiments were replenished. The Janissary corps expanded with fresh conscripts drawn from the Devshirme. Mehmed intended not just to march north, but to erase resistance from memory. Envoys rode out across the Sultan's dominions, bearing orders sealed with vermilion wax. To the Crimean Khanate went a message promising reward for a northern raid into Bessarabia. To Wallachia, a command cloaked as invitation. Basarab Lyota was to redeem his betrayal by leading his forces once more under the Crescent. The Balkans stirred uneasily as word spread of a new campaign, the greatest since the fall of Constantinople. In Moldavia, scouts already whispered of movement along the Danube. Merchants brought tales of armor convoys passing through Sofia, of engineers testing new siege guns in Thrace. Each rumor reached Stephen like a tremor before the quake. The voivode did not celebrate his earlier triumph. He rebuilt fortresses, repaired the burned villages, and gathered grain for another winter that would not bring peace. He knew what was coming. Empires do not die of one wound. South of the Danube, the Sultan's armies assembled through the spring of 1476 AD. The air around Edirne trembled with the clang of iron and the groan of oxen dragging artillery toward the frontier. Mehmed reviewed his troops from horseback, Janissaries in neat ranks, Sipahi glittering under banners that caught the wind like fire. Behind them came contingents from every corner of his dominion. Albanians, Bosnians, Bulgarians, Anatolian Turks, Arabs, Tatars, and the horsemen of Crimea. It was less an army than a moving world. The Sultan himself would command it. Age had lined his face, but his eyes burned with the same fever that had carried him through the breach of Constantinople's walls. His courtiers whispered that he sought not only vengeance, but redemption, that he meant to cleanse his shame in northern blood. Every hour of his life since Vaslui had been an insult endured. Now it would be repaid. By early summer, the logistics were complete. The supply depots along the Danube brimmed with grain and gunpowder. Herds of oxen grazed in the meadows, ready to be slaughtered for the march. Smiths worked day and night repairing weapons. The air reeked of tar and sweat. From the palace, arsenals in Constantinople, came new standards embroidered in gold thread. A rising sun on red silk, symbol of a renewed dawn. They were to be carried before the Sultan himself. As preparations swelled, rumors reached even the courts of the West. In Buda, King Matthias read the reports and said nothing. In Rome, Sixtus IV prayed for Christendom's deliverer, though no crusade formed. In Venice, merchants calculated the price of defeat or victory, whichever would serve them best. Europe admired Stephen's courage, but feared Mehmed's momentum. None would intervene. When the army finally moved, the ground shook. Columns of men stretched across the plains of Bulgaria, the sound of their march echoing through mountain passes like thunder delayed. Birds fled from the noise. Villages emptied before them, their inhabitants slipping north in terrified silence. Behind the army rolled siege guns so vast they broke bridges and roads alike. It was said that the smallest of them could hurl a boulder heavy as 10 men. The largest was named the Lion's Voice, for it roared even when it missed its mark. At night, campfires lit the horizon like a second sunrise. The Sultan rode among his troops without escort, pausing to speak to officers, to inspect cannon crews, to remind his men that what had been lost in one winter would be reclaimed in another. The soldiers answered with their drums, a thunder that rolled from one end of the host to the other. Even the river seemed to change its course to accommodate them. In Suceava, Stephen's lookouts saw the first glint of that fire on the southern horizon. He gathered his captains in the fortress chapel, where the smell of wax and incense mixed with cold air from the open door. On the wall behind him hung a tattered banner taken from Vaslui, its colours faded, its cloth stiff with time. He stared at it for a long moment before turning back to his men. They needed no speeches. Every soldier in the northern realm knew what approach meant. This was not another raid. This was Empire itself coming to reclaim the silence that victory had broken. As the Sultan's host crossed into Wallachia, the wind shifted. It carried the sound of drums, the clatter of hooves, the metallic breath of 10,000 men. Spring turned to summer. Fields blackened under their passage. The Danube, once a border, became a road. The great campaign of vengeance had begun. Summer arrived heavy and strange. The fields south of the Carpathians ripened without joy, for everyone knew the harvest would belong to war. Dust clouds on the southern horizon marked where Mehmed II's army devoured the distance between Wallachia and the frontier. Every day brought new tremors through the earth, as if the world itself remembered the footsteps of empire. The Sultan's host crossed the Danube in a blaze of banners. From the western shore to the delta, the river bore pontoon bridges and rafts crammed with men and guns. The air was a roar of drums, oxen, shouts, and water beaten into white foam. Above them, new standards rippled, red silk sewn with the rising sun of Mehmed's renewed vengeance. Behind that radiance came the darkness of numbers, more than 100,000 soldiers, drawn from every corner of the realm. Janissaries, Sipahi, Azaps, Akuncha, Bosnians hardened by siege, Crimean Tatars swift as wind, Wallachian vassals with faces turned half away from their masters. This was not the army that had perished at Vaslui. It was larger, colder, stripped of arrogance. Each man carried the unspoken memory of those lost in the fog 2 years before. Even the Sultan's order of march reflected the lesson. Supply lines doubled, scouts dispatched ahead in layers, no step taken without a bridge ready to follow. Mehmed II had learned. His fury had made him meticulous. At the heart of this living machine rode the Sultan himself. Grey streaked his beard now, but his back remained straight, his eyes sharp under the rim of a plain iron helm. He spoke little, yet every officer who came before him felt the pressure of expectation, the certainty that this campaign was both punishment and absolution. The defeat of 1475 had been an insult to empire, and empire was a thing that could not endure insult. The columns entered Wallachia in waves. Villages emptied before them. Basarab Lyota, restored to his precarious throne by Ottoman favour, met Mehmed near Bucharest and swore again that his loyalty was unbroken. His words slid across the Sultan's silence like arrows striking stone. Basarab's contingent joined the march, its soldiers watching the Janissaries with dread rather than pride. They had seen what the North could do. Now they would see what the Empire would do in return. As the campaign advanced, the earth trembled with its passage. Dust rose and hung like a storm without rain. The Danube crossing behind them collapsed under its own weight, a bridge no longer needed. Ahead lay the green wilderness of Moldavia, now reborn from its ashes. Forests thick as walls, rivers twisting through marsh, villages rebuilt from the ruins left by war. These would again be the Sultan's adversaries. In Suceava, Stephen had already begun his counter-prayer. Fortresses were repaired, new earthworks dug, and messengers sent to every corner of his small dominion. His earlier victory had made him legend, but it had not made him safe. He understood that this was no punitive raid, but an invasion aimed at erasure. The monasteries became garrisons. Peasants fled into the mountains, leaving behind empty houses and fields seeded only with traps. The Osteomyca gathered again, leaner, older, its veterans moving with the calm of men who had already survived the impossible once. The Osteomere, the greater host, was called as well. a tide of farmers and craftsmen who came bearing spears, axes, and the stubbornness of those who had nothing left to lose. When the first scouts returned from the south, their news carried both wonder and despair. The Sultan's army stretched for miles. Its artillery alone outnumbered the entire Moldavian host. Cannon the size of towers rolled on wheels reinforced with iron bands, drawn by teams of 40 oxen. Siege engineers marched ahead of the guns to level roads and fortify crossings. Behind them followed wagons loaded with food, arrows, and raw iron. This was conquest rendered into arithmetic. Stephen did not attempt to match numbers. He prepared the land instead. The valleys were flooded, bridges dismantled, forests laced with hidden pits. Once again, fire became his ally. Villages burned, leaving behind blackened fields that would feed no one. When Mehmed's scouts returned with reports of desolation, the Sultan only nodded. He expected this. The North's defiance would melt before the Empire's patience. By midsummer, the invaders reached the upper Siret. The heat pressed down like a weight. Dust turned the rivers to sludge, and the very air smelled of ash and sweat. Moldavian cavalry struck at the flanks, burning supply wagons and vanishing into forest. But the Empire advanced all the same. Mehmed refused to be lured into the narrow valleys where his predecessor had perished. He marched slowly, building fortified camps each night, ensuring every step forward could be retraced. Behind him, the field surgeons burned the bodies of men who died of exhaustion. Then came the turning of fortune, the first resistance that would not dissolve. Near the fortress of Ackerman, Stephen's outposts made their stand. Cannon thundered from ramparts rebuilt in haste. For 3 days the Janissaries battered the walls, and on the 4th the city fell. The Sultan rode through the breach without expression. His standard rose above the Black Sea, and the guns of the fleet answered with their own salute. Ackerman was his first prize, a fortress turned into a doorway. Through it, the Empire poured. From that moment, the campaign became a tide. The Sultan advanced along 3 fronts, one column pushing north through the coastal plain, another cutting through the forests of Bessarabia, and the main force driving straight for the heart of the principality. Smoke marked their path. The crops burned, and the rivers filled with the carcasses of oxen and men. Villages that had survived one war now vanished beneath the second. Stephen met the invasion with his own rhythm of retreat. He would strike, vanish, and strike again. The mountains became his allies, the forests his fortress walls. Each engagement cost him men he could not replace. But each delay bought time, and time was the only weapon that could slow an empire. Behind him, the monasteries stored grain, weapons, and manuscripts, treasures of both body and spirit. Moldavia bled, but did not bow. By late July, the 2 great armies faced each other near a place called Valea Alba, the White Valley. The name would prove prophetic. The Sultan's forces spread across the plain like a second landscape, tents, cannon, and banners filling the horizon. Opposite them, Stephen's host, perhaps 30,000 at most, took position among wooded ridges and ravines. The air shimmered with heat. It smelled of pine and powder. The battle that followed lasted a single day and a single night. The voivode's soldiers fought as they had at Vaslui, with ambush, deception, and fire. The forests burned, smoke stinging eyes and lungs. Moldavian cannon roared from concealed ridges, tearing gaps into the Janissary lines, but numbers prevailed. By evening, the defenders were pressed back to their final position, a line of makeshift barricades built from carts and timbers. Stephen unleashed his cavalry in a desperate charge, 4,000 riders crashing against an army 10 times their size. For an hour the empire wavered. Then the Janissaries rallied, and the forest became a furnace. When night fell, Mehmed ordered the advance renewed. His guard pushed through walls of flame and found only silence. The enemy had withdrawn, leaving the dead behind. The Sultan stood beneath the stars, soot on his armor, the taste of victory bitter on his tongue. Valea Alba was his triumph, but it was not conquest. The land refused to yield itself even in defeat. The next morning, the empire buried its own. Tens of thousands lay under the burnt pines. The valley's soil turned grey with ash and bone. For the Sultan, it was enough. He had avenged his honor, though not his ambition. He ordered prayers for the fallen and gave the signal to march onward. North of the battlefield, Stephen gathered what remained of his forces, battered, bleeding, unbroken. Behind him, the monastery's bells rang, their sound thin but defiant. The voivode knew he had lost a battle, yet saved his country. For every fortress taken, the empire left 1,000 graves. The land itself had fought beside him. As summer waned, the great invasion slowed. Supply lines stretched thin. Plague crept through the camps. Even Mehmed's iron will could not feed 100,000 men from fields reduced to dust. The Sultan turned his army south again, declaring victory, though he understood what kind of victory it was. A triumph that could not be held. The empire withdrew, leaving behind ruins and a memory carved in smoke. The White Valley was theirs for a season. The mountains, the rivers, and the stubborn people beyond them were not. The thunder of invasion faded, yet its echo remained in every broken wall and blackened tree. Roads once carved by armies, now led only to absence. Charred beams thrust out of the earth like ribs. Ruts of cannon wheels cut across fields that would never yield clean grain again. Even the air seemed altered, metallic, stale, carrying the memory of iron. Mehmed II's great host had withdrawn, leaving a vacuum that hummed with silence and disease. Moldavia still stood, but like a tower struck by lightning, upright, hollowed, uncertain of its own strength. Along the southern marches, villages no longer existed. Deeper inland, people crept from the woods, faces pale from months of hiding. When they heard the distant roll of drums, they did not flee. They waited, testing whether sound itself still meant danger. Stephen rode through what was left of his country. Smoke from burned harvests clung to his cloak. By the roadsides, peasants gathered as he passed, offering no cheer, only nods that carried gratitude and disbelief. Rule had changed its nature. It was no longer command, but companionship in survival. Before rest could claim his army, the voivode forced motion back into the realm. Couriers galloped between fortresses that had lived like islands through the storm. Messengers reached monasteries with orders to open their granaries and write down the names of the dead. In the towns, blacksmiths melted armor into nails and hinges. The same hands that had drawn swords now raised stones, rebuilding what war had taught them to destroy. Communication returned first, then breath. From Suceava, riders spread outward, carrying new decrees. Repair bridges, reclaim livestock, gather seed. Grain from the monasteries fed soldiers and orphans alike. Monks who had prayed behind barred gates now counted barrels of rye beside icons blackened by smoke. Prayer and administration learned to share the same parchment. Information followed food. Scouts brought reports from the border. Ottoman garrisons still occupied the lower Danube. Patrols crossed at night, and the Crimean auxiliaries scavenged along the coast. The empire's absence was only partial. Its shadow lingered across the plains. Stephen read each dispatch in silence, signing replies with a steady hand that betrayed no fatigue. his council watched him for signs of collapse and found none. Puris limped on a wounded leg, Arba's hair had turned silver, and Haru spoke less than before. Together, they rebuilt the system that had kept the principality alive when nothing else had. In their meetings, maps were spread on tables scarred by old fires. Instead of discussing victories, they talked of roads, rivers, and food. The war had moved from the sword to the ledger. Across the border, Mehmed's army retreated toward Edirne, stricken with plague. Columns of sick men clogged the roads. Supply carts carried more corpses than grain. The Sultan, hearing of it, offered no condolences and forbade public mourning. His vengeance had been achieved, yet it had cost him too much. The empire was immortal only in appearance. Its heart could tire. Stephen understood that truth better than any chronicler. The Sultan's withdrawal was not surrender, only recovery. Empires rested as lions rest, eyes half open. The prince ordered every fortress refortified, every road watched, every field measured for new harvest. Tribute to Constantinople remained suspended. He would pay again only when he must. Reconstruction spread like a slow contagion of hope. Nobles returned to their estates, not to collect rent, but to rebuild roofs. Villagers patched their walls with clay, mixed from the ashes of their churches. Smiths forged tools from shattered spears. At Nimes, a new gate rose where the old had fallen. On its arch, masons carved a single line in Latin. Faith holds the walls. No one spoke of peace. The word had grown unreliable. Yet there was order, a rhythm to work that dulled fear. Women tended new crops in soil still salted by old blood. Children followed ploughs drawn by thin horses that had once carried men into battle. Each furrow seemed a defiance against oblivion. In the monasteries, monks copied the story of Vaslui and Valea Alba, the twin agonies that had shaped their generation. The script was illuminated in gold leaf, but the margins were crowded with notes about famine, orphans, and broken villages. Even holiness could not disguise exhaustion. Stephen read those chronicles when they were sent to him, then returned them with corrections. He removed nothing of the horror. He only adjusted the verbs. Battles were no longer won or lost. They were endured. The chroniclers learned that language quickly. Diplomatic letters arrived from Poland and Hungary, weighted with courtesy. Once they had been lectures in obedience, now they carried respect. Their kings congratulated him, calling him Shield of the North. Venice sent a small chest of gold and a promise of friendship. The Pope wrote a second time, blessing the Athleta Christi and urging unity among Christian princes. None offered soldiers. Stephen had stopped expecting them to. Admiration was easier to send than armies. At Suceava, the court returned to its routines. Smaller, quieter, seasoned by loss. Festivals were postponed. Sermons replaced parades. The voivode presided over matters of taxation, justice, and rebuilding, as if those acts themselves were battles. He walked with a slight limp now, but his voice carried through the great hall, with the same calm weight it had before the wars. To those who saw him close, he appeared made not of pride, but of fatigue, shaped into discipline. Far to the south, Mehmed turned his gaze toward new conquests. Albania, the Aegean islands, the shores of Italy. He did not forget the north, but he understood that glory there cost too much coin and too many sons. For now, the Danube frontier would sleep under guard, its flames banked rather than extinguished. In the years that followed, conflict lingered in smaller forms. Ottoman patrols raided border hamlets. Moldavian riders struck back and vanished into forests. Skirmishes flared like sparks between rainstorms, quick, bright, and inconclusive. Each side claimed victory. Neither believed it. The war had changed into habit. Within the realm, recovery took root in unexpected ways. Markets reopened beside the ruins of old churches. Traders from Poland returned, their wagons heavy with salt and cloth. Bells rang again, though their tones were rough, mismatched, recast from melted cannon. The people learned to measure prosperity not in abundance, but in the absence of smoke on the horizon. When visitors described him to foreign courts, they spoke of a prince who ruled from a wooden chair carved by his own hand. He was seen in armor only during inspection. Otherwise, in plain wool, his sword within reach but seldom drawn. Each dawn, he attended mass in the chapel of Suceava before turning to matters of the realm. His letters, preserved in distant archives, reveal a ruler less interested in glory than in continuity. The empire might one day return, but for now, the rivers ran unguarded, the borders watched by their own people. Moldavia had learned to govern itself through endurance. That endurance became legend. On clear nights, when the fortress lay quiet, Stephen climbed the ramparts and looked across the dark landscape. No fires burned on the southern horizon. In the distance, he could hear the faint toll of monastery bells, steady, unbroken, familiar. It was not triumph he felt, nor even relief, only recognition, the sound of a land still breathing. Moldavia had survived again, wounded, watchful, unwilling to die. Faint traces of war's fire remained, touching every throne with their shadow. In Europe's courts, messengers spoke of the miracle in the north, how Stephen the Great had held his ground against Mehmed II, how the army of Islam had been broken by fog and faith. The story arrived softened by distance, burnished by admiration. Yet behind every retelling lay the same uneasy truth. Christendom had watched him fight alone. Stephen understood that silence better than any word of praise. Once his land began to breathe again, he turned from rebuilding walls to rebuilding alliances. The sword had bought survival. Diplomacy might buy time. Envoys rode out from Suceava under banners newly mended but still scarred by fire. Their saddlebags carried letters written in the prince's own hand, addressed to kings who had once ignored him. Each began with courtesy and ended with quiet reproach. Poland, Hungary, Venice, Rome. The same names, the same hesitations. They had treated Moldavia as a frontier. Now it was proof that the frontier could hold. Poland answered first. King Casimir sent warm words and a gift of silver icons, but avoided the subject of troops. Hungary replied next. Matthias I praised his brother in arms and promised protection, provided that Moldavia remained obedient. Stephen read the letters in his chamber and laid them aside, unread a second time. Promises were a coin with no metal in it. From Rome came a parchment covered in gilded Latin. Pope Sixtus IV hailed him again as Athleta Christi and urged unity among Christian princes against the Ottoman threat. The words were splendid and hollow, written by men who measured courage in parchment rather than blood. Yet the prince ordered them copied and read aloud in every monastery. Morale required ceremony. Venice alone spoke in the language he respected, money and intelligence. Their merchants, bled by the empire's customs duties in the Aegean, offered alliance through trade. Venetian gold rebuilt river forts. Venetian agents brought rumors of Ottoman troop movements. The Republic acted not from virtue, but from rivalry, which suited Stephen fine. Motives mattered less than results. Diplomacy for him was another battlefield, fought with couriers instead of cavalry. He courted one king against another, always careful to appear loyal to all. Letters of friendship to Poland carried warnings about Hungary. Letters to Hungary hinted at Polish ambition. To Rome, he wrote of unity. To Venice, of opportunity. It was a delicate choreography of necessity, the art of remaining small but indispensable. At home, these efforts changed more than foreign policy. The capital began to hum with movement again. Suceava's courtyards filled with envoys, translators, and scribes. Flags from half of Europe fluttered above the citadel, proof that even the mighty had to pass through Moldavia to reach one another. Within its halls, Stephen moved with deliberate calm, his limp more pronounced, his eyes colder. The prince who had once led cavalry charges now fought through conversation. The voivode's council expanded to match the age of correspondence. Paris managed military matters. Arbor oversaw foreign visitors. Haru kept records of treaties and debts. Each new alliance was a thread. Stephen held them like a weaver, knowing one slip could unravel the whole design. Diplomacy did not thrill him, but it suited his endurance. He also turned attention eastward. The Polish crown could not be trusted to stand alone, but the merchant cities of the Black Sea offered trade, and trade was another form of defense. Grain, timber, and salt began moving again through Kaffa and Lvov. Moldavian cattle once more reached the markets of Krakow. Each caravan was an act of reconstruction disguised as commerce. The prince imposed new tolls and used the revenue to maintain fortresses along the Siret. War had taught him that coin, properly spent, could be stronger than walls. In Constantinople, Mehmed received reports of this renewed activity. His spies wrote of Moldavian merchants wearing embroidered coats, of envoys welcomed by Western princes, of a realm that no longer trembled. The Sultan smiled, not with amusement, but with recognition. He understood ambition when he saw it. Still, his eyes turned westward now, to Italy, to new seas to cross. The north could wait. Even without invasion, the border remained alive. Ottoman garrisons along the Danube tested their strength with small raids. Stephen's captains answered in kind, striking swiftly, withdrawing faster. Neither side declared war, but neither permitted peace. The frontier became a moving argument written in smoke. Inside the monasteries, the chroniclers continued their work. They described these years, not as recovery, but as vigilance. To them, the victory at Vaslui and the endurance after Valea Ulba were parts of the same story. The defense of faith against the long patience of empire. Illuminated manuscripts traveled with envoys as gifts, each one a statement. A small country with a large memory. Stephen used memory like a weapon. When foreign dignitaries arrived, he received them beneath the captured Ottoman cannon displayed in Suceava's courtyard. Their black mouths pointed toward the sky, a silent sermon on resistance. The prince spoke rarely of battles, preferring to discuss roads, taxation, and the rebuilding of monasteries. Yet every visitor left aware that behind the calm words lived a man who had seen the empire bleed. Through patience and pressure, Moldavia's diplomatic web tightened. Venice sent more merchants, Poland more treaties, Hungary more nervous gestures of fraternity. Even Moscow, still distant and half legendary, sent an emissary to observe this strange prince who defied the Sultan. Stephen welcomed him with austere courtesy and demanded no alliance. It was enough to be seen. Within his realm, peace of a sort settled. Farmers returned to their fields. Traders reopened routes to the Baltic, and craftsmen restored the churches that had been burned. Yet beneath that surface calm, everything remained provisional. Every fortress stored winter grain beside powder. Every monastery kept one bell unsanctified, ready to ring for war. The people lived between vigilance and fatigue, knowing how quickly the border could come alive again. As the decade deepened, the prince's health began to fail. The limp worsened, his voice grew rougher. He governed from a high-backed chair carved with his emblem, a sun half hidden by clouds. When the pain grew sharp, he joked that even the weather in his bones had learned caution. Yet his hand remained firm when he signed decrees, and his mind was as clear as ever. What he built in those years was less a peace than a breathing space, a moment in which the country could rebuild its muscles before the next blow. The chroniclers would later call it the quiet reign, but it was quiet only in sound. Every day was a calculation: how far the Sultan's patience would reach, how long Europe's attention would last. From his tower at Suceava, Stephen watched traders cross the rebuilt bridges, their wagons heavy with salt, wine, and cloth. The noise of commerce was the only sound he trusted. War had its music, the drum, the trumpet, the scream. But peace required humbler instruments: the creak of a wheel, the strike of a hammer, the toll of a bell at dusk. By 1480, Moldavia stood again at the edge of two worlds: vulnerable, defiant, self-sufficient. It was no longer merely a barrier between empires, but a voice among them, speaking with quiet authority born from survival. In foreign capitals, Stephen's name had become shorthand for endurance. In his own land, it was enough to mean stability. He had learned what even kings often forgot: that glory fades faster than order. The treaties he signed, the roads he repaired, the grain he stored, these were victories too, though they bore no banners. When envoys departed from Suceava, they rode past the captured cannons and the chapel built from their wreckage. The prince always stood to watch them go, leaning on his staff, the air around him faintly scented with forge smoke. Behind him, the bells of the fortress rang their measured rhythm, not of triumph, but of persistence. Beyond the hills, the empire still waited. It would wait a long time. Years passed, yet the fog of Vaslui never quite lifted. Its memory lingered like a taste of metal in the mouths of soldiers and in the dreams of kings who had never seen the field. Across Europe, the story travelled faster than armies: how a small northern principality had humbled the Sultan of the East. Chroniclers embroidered it with the gold of legend, but beneath every retelling lay a simple truth. The battle had changed the imagination of an age. In Rome, the victory was proclaimed a miracle. Preachers thundered that faith had conquered the Crescent. Painters filled chapel walls with scenes of heavenly intervention. In Venice, merchants celebrated for reasons more practical. The trade routes of the Black Sea were open again, at least for a time. Poland and Hungary claimed a share of glory they had never earned. Even the German cities toasted a man they would never meet. Only in the north itself did the story remain unfinished. Stephen listened to these rumors from Suceava with a faint smile. To him, Vaslui was not a miracle, but a calculation executed under mercy. Yet he allowed the legend to grow. Legends had their uses. They could travel where envoys could not. The prince ordered that the chronicles of his victory be copied in every monastery, not as pride, but as protection. Memory was a fortress no army could besiege. Within the empire, the disaster had left its own kind of mark. Mehmed II ruled on, but his northern ambition had cooled. He no longer spoke of marching to Krakow or Vienna. His generals planned campaigns toward the west and the sea instead, where stone walls yielded faster than forests. The Sultan's courtiers learned never to mention the name Vaslui in his presence. It had become an echo he refused to hear. But empires forget slowly, and resentment endures longer than failure. Even after Mehmed's death in 1481, his successors kept watch over the border. The Danube frontier became a line of suspicion rather than invasion, a wound sealed but never healed. The Ottoman commanders in Wallachia rebuilt fortresses, reorganized trade routes, and taxed merchants harshly as if money could fill the silence left by the vanished host. From these precautions, the shape of a new equilibrium emerged. The empire no longer sought to swallow the north, only to contain it. For Moldavia, that uneasy balance was both shield and burden. The prince who had saved his country from conquest now found himself ruling within the shadow of his own triumph. Every visitor, every envoy, every wandering monk spoke of Vaslui as if it were a crown he could never remove. In victory, he had become a symbol, and symbols cannot rest. The years that followed were years of building. The charred towns of the frontier grew back as clusters of timber and stone. New monasteries rose along the rivers, their frescoes bright with saints painted from memory of the fallen. Stephen visited each as they were completed, walking among masons and monks, speaking softly but rarely smiling. He had seen too much glory to trust it. Among the people, the battle became a tale, half historical, half sacred. Parents told their children that angels had fought beside their prince, that the fog had been sent by God to hide them from the Turks. The truth did not matter. What mattered was that faith could imagine victory, and imagination itself was a kind of armor. Europe's rulers, meanwhile, drew their own lessons. In Buda, King Matthias studied the Moldavian campaign and reformed his army, building a standing force trained to fight in forests and mud. In Krakow, advisors spoke of alliances among small states to resist the Ottoman tide. In the courts of Italy, writers compared Stephen to ancient heroes, though none could pronounce his name correctly. For a brief span, the world remembered that geography alone did not dictate survival. Yet even legend has weight. Moldavia's independence depended as much on perception as on strength. Stephen understood that as clearly as any diplomat. He nurtured the image of his realm as Christendom's frontier, righteous, steadfast, and poor. It invited sympathy, and sympathy bought time. Behind the image, he governed with caution, ensuring that neither Poland nor Hungary could claim him entirely as their vassal. He had fought to keep his country's shape. Now he fought to keep its space. The Sultan's spies continued to operate across the border, their reports oddly respectful. They wrote of a land rebuilt from ashes, of roads patrolled by soldiers who carried icons on their saddles, of monasteries rising like fortresses in the hills. Even the Ottoman chroniclers, Tursun Beg among them, admitted that the voivode of Moldavia had created a state that endured through faith as much as steel. They called him the Mountain Prince, a man who ruled from a throne of stone and silence. At home, the prince's court had changed. The hall that had once resounded with war councils now filled with architects, scribes, and monks. Where drums had thundered, there was the sound of chisels shaping marble. Each new monastery he founded, Putna, Voronezh, Potroci, was both prayer and policy, a message carved into landscape, that the country still lived, still believed, still stood between worlds. The voivode's health, however, declined. Old wounds stiffened his gait. His right hand trembled when he wrote, yet his will remained unbroken. He continued to ride across the frontier to inspect garrisons, wrapped in a cloak heavy enough to hide pain. Those who saw him up close spoke of a face carved by discipline rather than age. When asked why he built so many churches, he answered that the stones would pray when men could not. By the 1490s, the memory of Vaslui had hardened into myth. Travelers from the west came to see the battlefield as pilgrims might visit a shrine. They took handfuls of soil, pieces of arrowhead, small tokens to carry home. The locals watched in silence. To them, the valley was neither miracle nor monument. It was the scar where their fathers had vanished. When the fog returned each winter, they said it was the dead reclaiming the ground. Even in Constantinople, scholars and soldiers argued over what the battle had meant. Some called it an accident of weather, others a masterpiece of cunning. The truth lay somewhere in between, lost in mist. For Mehmed's empire, it had been a lesson in limits. For Europe, a rare proof that empire itself could bleed. Stephen lived long enough to see his own legend turn into prophecy. His people began to call him not only the Great, but the Holy, though the church had not yet agreed. Pilgrims visited his monasteries, leaving coins and prayers for the endurance of the realm. He greeted them with the humility of a man who knew that devotion and desperation are often the same. In his final years, ambassadors continued to pass through Suceava, men with smoother hands and brighter speech than any soldier. They found a ruler who spoke of faith as strategy and of patience as a weapon. He told them that the true frontier was not the river or the mountain, but the heart that refused to yield. None could tell whether it was wisdom or fatigue. The fog of Vaslui outlived all of them. Long after armies changed banners and princes changed names, the story persisted, how a small land at the edge of Europe had defied an empire and survived. Maps would shift, fortresses crumble, empires fade, yet the valley remained, holding its silence like an oath. When later generations searched for proof of the miracle, they found none. Only a plain of grass and a river that still smelled faintly of iron after rain. But those who listened closely swore they could hear, in the murmuring of water against stone, the low, steady rhythm of hooves, echoes of a battle that refused to end. Age came quietly to the man who had lived through too many dawns of war. It did not conquer him. It surrounded him, patient and precise, as he had once surrounded his enemies. The beard that had been black beneath the helmet of Vaslui was now silver. The hand that once held a sword signed decrees with measured care. His step, once astride, had become a deliberate pace. Yet when Stephen the Great walked through the courtyards of Suceava, men still straightened as if the empire itself had entered the room. The realm he had defended was smaller than his legend, but stronger than its beginnings. Moldavia's frontiers held. The villages rebuilt after the invasions now smoked with hearth fires again, and trade moved along the Siret and Prut. The monasteries he had founded stood like guardians of memory, Putna, Voronets, Neamts, each a citadel of prayer where the past was painted on the walls in the blue of eternity. He visited them often, traveling not as conqueror but as pilgrim. At Putna, his favorite among them, the monks laid down their chisels when he arrived and bowed as to a living relic. He would kneel before the altar, motionless for long minutes, his breath a whisper lost among the candles. Faith had always been his armor, though now it served as medicine. To those who asked why he prayed so often, he replied that a man who commands must first learn to ask forgiveness. The world beyond his borders did not rest. Empires shifted like tides. Mehmed II was long dead, succeeded by sons who carried his ambition, but not his mind. New wars smoldered in the Balkans and the Mediterranean, drawing Ottoman strength southward. Poland and Hungary traded peace for influence, and the crowns of the West turned their eyes toward Italy. For a rare moment, Moldavia lay beyond the main currents of power. The voivodes had bought his people not eternity, but reprieve. In that breathing space, he governed as a craftsman finishes his life's work, with patience, with weight, with care. His council had thinned, Purus dead of old wounds, Arbora retired to his estate, Haru buried at Names, but their sons now served where their fathers had. The state they had forged from siege and famine had learned its own rhythm. Taxes were collected, courts held, roads kept passable even in snow. Soldiers trained at the fortresses for wars that might never come. The miracle of Vaslui had become habit. Letters still came from foreign courts. They addressed him now as Prince of the East, defender of the faith, friend of the West. He answered all with the same courtesy. His ambitions had narrowed to the size of his homeland. His victories no longer needed banners. They were counted in the stability of harvests, the birth of children, the slow return of laughter to markets. But solitude had grown around him. His wife, Maria of Mangop, was gone, his children scattered to alliances and monasteries. In the evenings, he would walk the ramparts alone, listening to the bells carried by the wind from Putna. The sound reminded him of the river fogs of his youth, those mornings before battle when the world held its breath and the future had not yet chosen sides. The prince's body betrayed him before his mind did. A wound received decades earlier refused to heal. By his 70th year, he walked with 2 canes and slept little. Pain became his last companion. When physicians begged him to rest, he told them that rulers rested only when forgotten. In his final months, he withdrew from court and lived among the monks at Putna. The chronicles describe him as serene, though serenity in such men is rarely peace. It is discipline turned inward. He dictated his last orders from a small cell lit by 1 lamp. Roads were to be maintained, grain stored, the border garrisons supplied before winter. Even dying, he governed. When the time came, the prince received communion, surrounded by the hum of prayer. The room smelled of wax and pine. Snow drifted against the shutters. His confessor later wrote that he whispered only 2 words before the end. It endures. Whether he meant his soul or his country, no one could say. He died in the summer of 1504, in the 57th year of his reign. Word spread slowly across the valleys and rivers. In villages that had known only his name, people wept as if a father had gone. Bells rang for a week without pause. The old soldiers who had followed him at Vaslui carried his body from Suceava to Putna on their shoulders. When the procession reached the monastery, thousands lined the road, holding candles that turned the dusk to gold. He was buried beneath a slab of white stone carved with his crest, a sword, a sun, and a cross entwined. Over the tomb, the monks sang until their voices broke. For decades afterward, travelers passed through the northern land and found his memory intact. They spoke of fields reclaimed, of fortresses kept in repair, of a people who carried themselves with quiet pride. Some said that on fog-heavy mornings, the valley of Vaslui still murmured like a sea of whispers, the ghosts of that victory refusing to rest. Others swore that on nights when thunder rolled from the Carpathians, they could hear distant drums echoing his name. In time, legend absorbed him. Chroniclers called him the Great and the Holy. The church canonized him centuries later, but the peasants had done so long before, lighting candles before his image, invoking him against invasion and plague. To them, he had not died. He had simply taken residence in the mountains, watching over the roads where empire might one day return. History, less sentimental, remembered him differently, as the man who measured himself against an empire and did not collapse. His victories were local, his defeats partial, yet the balance he struck outlasted them all. Between the Black Sea and the Carpathians, he had built not a kingdom, but a continuity. Generations later, envoys from distant courts would still pause at the chapel of Putna. They would stand before the stone and whisper the same observation, that the man beneath it had not conquered the world, but had prevented the world from conquering him. The chronicles closed there. The fog of Vaslui thinned, the empire shifted, the frontier changed hands again and again. Yet through centuries of forgetting, his name persisted. Even when maps no longer bore the same lines, stories of the voivode who outwitted Mehmed's legions survived, told by firelight, repeated by monks, carved into wood and faith. A single sentence appears in the last page of the oldest chronicle, written in faded ink by an anonymous hand. And when he was gone, the land did not fall. That was his final victory.